Un destello inteligente había en su mirada. Cuando le dije si quería bailar conmigo, se puso a hablar de Jung, de Freud y Lacan. Mi idiosincrasia le causaba mucha gracia. Me dijo al girar, la cumbia era intelectual. Me dijo al girar.
Jung, Freud, Simone de Beauvoir, Goethe, Beckett, Cosmos, Gershwin, Kurt, Weill, Guggenheim.
Estudiaba una carrera poco conocida, algo que ver con letra y filosofía. Era linda y hechicera su contoneada, y sus ojos de lince me atravesaban. Cuando intenté arrimarle mi brazo, se puso a hablar de Miller, de Lenin y Picasso. Y si osaba intentar robarle un beso, se ponía a leer de Neruda unos versos. Me hizo mucho mal, la cumbia era intelectual, no la puedo olvidar. Esa cumbia era intelectual. Si le decía vamos al cine rica, me decía veamos una de Kusturica. Si le decía vamos a leer las flores, me hablaba de Virginia Woolf y sus amores. Me hizo mucho mal, la cumbia era intelectual, no la puedo olvidar. Esa cumbia era intelectual. Le pedí que me enseñe a usar el Bauhaus, pero solo quiere hablarme del Bauhaus. Le pregunté si era chorra o rockera, me dijo que Stein era re tortillera, no la puedo olvidar.
Jarmusch, Küstov, Cocteau, Arto, Magui, Maran, Twyla, Farb, Gilda, Visconti, Gismonti.
Me hace daño. Yo no quiero que pienses tanto, cumbia era intelectual. Yo voy a rezarle a tu santo para que te pueda soltar.
Paul, Klee, Ante, Garmas, Kandinsky, Diego, Frida, Tolstoy, Bolshoi, Terry, Gilliam, Shakespeare, William.
To last throughout the years. So bring your good times and your laughter too. We gon' celebrate your party with you. Come on now. Celebration. Let's all celebrate and have a good time. Celebration. We gon' celebrate and have a good time. It's time to come together. It's up to you. What's your pleasure? Everyone around the world, come on! It's a celebration. It's a celebration. Celebrate good times, come on. Let's celebrate. There's a party going on right here. A dedication to last throughout the years. So bring your good times and your laughter too. We gon' celebrate and party with you. Come on now. Celebration. Let's all celebrate and have a good time. Yeah, yeah. Celebration. We gon' celebrate and have a good time. It's time to come together. It's up to you. What's your pleasure? Everyone around the world, come on! It's a celebration. It's a celebration. Celebrate good times, come on. Let's celebrate. Come on now. Celebrate good times, come on. Let's celebrate. We're gonna have a good time tonight. Let's celebrate. It's alright. We're gonna have a good time tonight. Let's celebrate. It's alright, baby. We're gonna have a good time tonight. Let's celebrate. It's alright. We're gonna have a good time tonight. Let's celebrate. It's alright.
Hola, buenas y muy otoñales tardes. Muchísimas gracias por haber venido desafiando el chirimiri. Y bueno, estamos esta noche para hablar con Andrei Kurkov, que es un escritor que tiene una vida más que curiosa, sobre la que le preguntaré. Entre otras cosas, escaqueó de espiar a Japón desde las Islas Kuriles, fue guardia de prisión en Odessa, donde se convirtió en escritor. Y bueno, parte de su obra tiene una obra muy amplia. Nació en Leningrado en 1961, en lo que entonces era Leningrado. Él pertenece a la minoría rusa de Ucrania, lo cual es un lío bastante complicado porque escribe en ruso pero se siente ucranio, entonces es un poco de una parte. Y su obra está siendo reeditada ahora mismo por la... ¿Se me oye bien? Sí. Por la editorial Lucky Books. Hace un par de años se publicó Muerte con un pingüino, que es un libro divertidísimo y profundamente negro de un escritor de necrológica que descubre que mata a la gente sobre la que escribe. ¿Se va la voz? A ver. Sí, a lo mejor funciona mejor con un micrófono de mano. ¿Ahora? Pues les prometo que no tengo la culpa. It's working
Yeah.
like if it was a Soviet microphone.
Soviet made.
Y bueno, que es un libro muy recomendable, y este del El jardinero de Ochakov, que acaba de salir, que también es otro libro muy recomendable. No quiero desvelarles mucho, pero bueno, es la historia de un joven llamado Igor que se pone un traje de miliciano, que vive en la actualidad, se pone un traje de miliciano de los años de 1957 y misteriosamente aparece en 1957. Y es una novela con mucho humor y cierta intriga. Y entonces, bueno, la conversación será en inglés, es más fácil, pero creo que tienen todos ustedes traducción. Esto suele ocurrir antes de las invasiones de marcianos. ¿Se me oye? Este tipo de fenómenos paranormales ocurren antes de las invasiones de marcianos, o sea que deberíamos estar bastante preparados. Y bueno, le preguntaré tanto por sus libros como por su vida, pero... Creo que no va a quedar más remedio que me dejen un micrófono de mano. A ver si lo pongo. Mira, ahí se calla. Entonces, first thing I want to ask you is, in your youth, as we are in a festival dedicated to the laugh and to the humor, in your youth you win a competition of Soviet jokes. Can you explain us what are the Soviet jokes and which are your favorite ones? I have my favorites too.
Buenas tardes. Well, I mean, in the Soviet Union, all the jokes were Soviet, as you understand. And we had, I think there were a lot of illegal competitions, which were usually supervised by KGB, but sometimes actually intellectuals managed to get together without KGB and to tell the jokes. And I participated in 3 such illegal competitions together with my elder brother, who was a dissident. And we were meeting every time in August in the Crimea, near town of Sudak. And in the night we would tell the jokes, and somebody would count and write down so that nobody would repeat the jokes. And actually, because I loved jokes so much, I started writing poetry at the age of 7, but at the age of 13, I started inventing jokes. And I was inventing them based already on existing series of jokes. Like we had Moldovan jokes, Jewish jokes, of course, Brezhnev jokes, etc. So I would just have the same characters but in different situations. And once we, with my brother, won 6 bottles of champagne, of Soviet champagne, for the Soviet jokes, because we didn't have other champagne.
Which is a joke.
Huh?
So the Soviet champagne is also a joke. And
Well, I mean, I think it was real.
And
French would not agree with this, of course.
And my favorite, for example, is one person who arrived after 40 years in a concentration in a labor camp, and he sees his mother much older in the when he gets out of the wagon, and he recognizes her immediately, and her mother asks you, how do you recognize me? And she says, because of the coat. And another one, which is this one is a Romanian joke, which is marvelous. Is watch. I think Mircea Cătărescu tell the same joke, but I think it's like a haiku. It's a wonderful joke. It's who is colder than the cold water in Romania, and they say the hot water. And another very good is why Ceausescu organized every 1st of May a big meeting in the center of Bucharest, and is because they want to count who has survived the winter. And which do you remember those?
Well, I remember, but I should explain the context, because, for example, one of my favorite jokes for many years was a joke from 1970s. It was Brezhnev's times, and in the Soviet history we had regularly official anti-Semitic campaigns when it was difficult for Jews to enter universities, to get good jobs, etc. And the joke is like this. Suddenly, in Moscow, on the Red Square, extraterrestrial missile lands, UFO lands, and immediately Brezhnev is told that we have a delegation from the space, so you should go and meet the captain. And the captain comes down from this UFO. He's a handsome man with a big golden medallion, with platinum chain, and with a diamond star on his coat. And so Brezhnev greets him and says that I see you are very important. You have this golden medallion. All people are wearing them in your planet. And the captain says, yes, everyone has golden medallion in our planet. And the platinum chain, it's also for everybody in your planet. And Brezhnev says, no, the captain says, yes, everyone has beautiful, heavy platinum chain. And the diamond star, is it actually also something that everyone has? And the captain says, no, not everybody. And Brezhnev asks, only very important people? And the captain says, no, only Jews.
And also we're talking...
I can, just to compare, I mean, we have a problem now with jokes in Ukraine. There are not many new jokes because there is no censorship, and I mean, the freedom kills sometimes the humor. In Russia, I mean, they are very happy because they have new jokes, because they don't have so much freedom. And one of the recent jokes I've heard and I liked very much was about Mitterrand, Reagan and Putin having a guided tour of hell. And personally, devil is taking them around to show where they will land. And they walk in the administration building, and there is a door open to the office, and there is a desk and a telephone. And Reagan says, do you have a telephone line in the hell? And devil says, of course we have. Can I call White House? Yes, $5 million, and you can call. And Reagan says, okay, they will pay. And he goes, talks for 5 minutes with the White House, comes back very happy, and Mitterrand asks, can I call Champs-Élysées, Palais des Champs-Élysées? And devil says, of course, yes, 5 million euros, and you can call. So he goes, talks to French politicians, comes back very happy, and Putin says, can I call the Kremlin? And devil says, of course, yes, please, 10 euro cents. And Reagan and Mitterrand are shocked, and they say, why we are paying millions, and he's paying peanuts, 10 cents. And devil says, well, you were using international lines, he will use local.
And we finish the joke, there is another joke of the period where there was nothing in the shops in the Soviet Union, who is a woman who enters in a shop and say, do you have sausage? And he says, no, we don't have fish. The shop who doesn't have sausage is the shop in front. So to understand, and it's those two books who has recently published in Spain, to understand the Soviet Union, do you need the humor? It's possible to understand it without humor?
Well, you need humor, or you needed humor to survive in the Soviet Union. Because if you take seriously what was happening, then you are a sad person. You will be depressed. But if you learn how to laugh at the reality, then you can survive. So, I mean, without humor, you wouldn't be able to remain sane, remain psychologically healthy. And now to talk about the Soviet Union, I mean, you can talk without humor. You can talk about Gulag, about 40 million killed in the Second World War, about millions of people died of hunger. But at the same time, I mean, if you talk about Stalin, all the personalities who are behind the historical dramas, I mean, you cannot talk without humor about them. And actually, in the Stalin's time, if you were joking about Stalin, you could end up in prison in Gulag for 25 years. In Brezhnev's time, in the beginning, you could be imprisoned for 10 years. And then in 78, 79, 80, it was already almost unpunishable. So, I mean, you could be punished administratively, but you wouldn't be put into prison.
And now, if you make your joke about Putin?
Well, I don't know about, I think actually in Russia you can make jokes about Putin, but not on TV, not in the press, not on radio, and not very loud.
And not in the street, in the street of
Yes.
And you have your own problem with Putin, because your books are forbidden.
My books are banned for the second time. The first time actually they were banned in 2005 after Orange Revolution because of my interviews about Russian-Ukrainian relationship abroad, and because of my book, The President's Last Laugh, where Putin is one of the characters. And the book was published in 2004 in March. And in this book, actually, Putin promises the main character of the book, who is Ukrainian president, to annex Crimea and to cut gas supply, which happened 1 year later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he take the idea for your book from your book?
No, but in this book, actually, my main character, for example, during re-elections, he is poisoned by his friends and he gets a skin disease. And the book was published half a year before poisoning of Yushchenko during presidential elections. So in January 2005, I was invited by 2 generals of Ukrainian Secret Service to have coffee and cognac.
And you don't take nothing, no? You don't drink anything?
No, I drank, because I mean, I knew one of them very well, and the other one was the head of the SBU, of Secret Service of Ukraine, and they took me to the Belgian restaurant, and when they ordered for me 50 grams of Hennessy, I understood that they will ask about the book, because my Ukrainian president loves Hennessy. And they asked, I mean, it was a friendly conversation. It was not like question-answer, because, I mean, we were just talking, chatting. And they said, do you think that your book could be used as the scenario for poisoning Yushchenko? And I said, no, because people who poison others professionally, they don't read fiction. They read professional literature. And then the other thing is that actually the poisoning of Yushchenko was not first poisoning in the post-Soviet space. It was already poisoning number 3 or 4. So you could actually trace from where it comes. But then I had very positive news. In March 2005. I was launching this book in Paris Book Fair. And I received invitation from Mr. Hennessy because he understood that I made a lot of publicity for the cognac in the book and I was not paid. So he invited me for 5 days to Cognac, And I drank Hennessy with Hennessy. And we are still friends. He is my reader, I'm his drinker.
So it's better than the Soviet champagne of
Oh,
your
you
youth.
definitely better, yes.
And did you not? I mean, after this book, why do you not stop writing? I mean,
Actually, I mean, after this book,
it's
I
like
thought,
to be very concerned.
well, I mean, I have a problem, probably psychological problem. I love watching political news, and at the same time, I hate politics, and I don't like politicians. And I tried to find a way how to cure myself from this interest to politics, and I couldn't. But after this book, I thought, now I will not write about politics at all, because, I mean, I had more consequences. I don't have time to tell about them. But I thought, I will write about love. And I started writing a book which is called The Night Milkman, about a lady, a single mother, and sort of her adventure in Kiev. And then I stopped. I thought, it doesn't work. I decided to write the same novel about two women in Kiev. And I wrote 70 pages, and it didn't work. I didn't feel I like it. So finally, I ended up with 3 stories of 3 women in Kiev, in Ukraine. And then I added a politician to this 3, and the novel worked. So, I mean, it's, I don't know, I mean, it's like a spice. I mean, the Ukrainian politics definitely is a spice. If you want to make something tasty, you add politics instead of curry.
And in this book, you have a wonderful sentence in one moment, who this character says, do you have fun? And he says, do you have fun from sadness or from happiness? So it's true that your books and in general, they are very fun, but also they are very sad. I mean, you feel like...
Well, I started actually, I published 24 novels by now, and 10 books for children. So my first published novels were not so funny, because I was very interested in real Soviet history in the times when the fake Soviet history was official. And it is because family story, because my grandmother, my grandmother was Stalinist, and my grandfather was Stalinist. And my grandfather died when he was 80, and only after his death I found out that his 2 brothers were imprisoned, sent to Gulag in 1930s. And then one spent 25 years. And they both were communists and sort of the heads of local committees of Communist Party in the northern Russia. And so I decided to find out more what was life like in 1930s, 40s, 50s. And I traveled for years, actually, hitchhiking and river hiking in the Soviet Union. I was a student.
River hiking?
Yeah. In the north, actually, you can stop boats, fishermen's boats, and on Onega Lake and river.
Yeah, you're in a lake like this?
Yeah. And it was very interesting. I mean, people were very open. I mean, there were no tourists there. So, I mean, every stranger was appreciated as somebody to talk to and to find out news from where he comes. And I had wonderful meetings during this travels, and very strange meetings, because, for example, I found in the Crimea a very old man who was working as the night keeper of parking space for the sanatorium for the police. And he was like 87. He lived in a very small, well, not even a house. It's like a box, but he lived there with a very old lady who was very loud, and she was a war veteran. And he turned out to be one of the special judges in Stalin's times. We had so-called troikas, so 3 judges which would go, lots of people were arrested, and they were traveling from one police station to another, signing the sentences, and very often just signing that this person should be executed. And I talked, I mean, I have about 7 or 8 hours of conversations with them. I should confess, I was lying to all these people that I am a student of journalism, and I'm learning how to run interviews. Of course, I never studied journalism. I was a student of Linguistic Pedagogical University and of Translator's School for the Japanese language. But he told me, I mean, like all his life. And he was mixing personal with his job. So like he said in the very beginning that when he was 16, he decided that his wife's name will be Nada, Nadezhda. Nadezhda means hope. It's typical Slavic name. And he found one Nadezhda, he married her, and then several years later she died because of the illness. And he found another Nadezhda, and he had a problem with her. I think they divorced, and then he found third Nadezhda. So all his life was accompanied by the hope, by Nadezhda. But at the same time, in between, he was this special. He remembered actually, for example, he said that, oh, I sentenced to death one gypsy young lady who crossed from Romania into Soviet Union in Ukraine. She was so beautiful. And I mean, he was talking about these horrible things with a smile on his face because he was remembering his best times in his life when he was young, when something depended on him, well, somebody's lives depended on him. At the same time, he was fulfilling his dream to have a wife with the name Nadezhda. And I mean, it was surreal and very real at the same time. And I wrote a trilogy, like 3 volumes, one novel about history of evolution of Soviet utopical mentality from 1918 till 1974. And I used him as a character in the book.
And this book...
And I mean, these are much funnier than the first books, yeah.
But this one is also about this kind of nostalgia, no? Because
well, I don't have nostalgia
no,
myself.
but some of your characters have, no? And is there any kind, because for example in the old Yugoslavia there is a word called Yugonostalgia, and there is quite a lot of Yugonostalgia in some perhaps who remember when they were happy.
Well,
in the 80s.
it's normal.
Is there a lot of Soviet nostalgia in the old Soviet Union?
Well, I mean, if you are born in the Soviet time, if you were young in the Soviet time, if you were in love in the Soviet time, you will have good memories. You will be nostalgic, but it will be not necessarily nostalgia about Soviet system. It will be nostalgia about happy past. I mean, in Ukraine we have another phenomena where, I mean, we have nostalgia about things which never happened. And it's like many intellectuals in Western Ukraine, and Western Ukraine was part of Austrian-Hungarian Empire before 1918. And so intellectuals decided that life in Austrian-Hungarian Empire was a fairy tale. It was beautiful and wonderful, and then the Soviet Union came, or Poland came to some part of Ukraine, and everything went bad. In fact, actually, Austrian-Hungarian Empire was very cruel, and lots of people were killed. But in the new novels written by young Ukrainian writers who are younger than me, they write about those times, romanticizing the picture of the past, sort of creating the past which never existed. And they believe that actually it was almost ideal society, ideal state.
And how do you get the idea of a person who suddenly wears an uniform of 1957 and appears in 1957?
Well, you know what I think? I mean, if you have a couple of glasses of cognac, you personally.
Hennessy.
Yeah, you can take Hennessy, yeah. And then you find a uniform of Spanish policeman of 1933, and you put it on. It will definitely influence your behavior and your thoughts, because uniform very often takes over the personality. You lose your personality when you put on uniform, because uniform dictates who you are, and what you are supposed to do. So, I mean, for me, I mean, like, I don't know why, not because of this book, my youngest son, who is 16, he's crazy about old uniforms. And he found my uniform from the army and managed to actually walk in this uniform in the village where we have a countryside house. And I thought that he is trying to get into the past. I'm happy he failed. But generally, I think this is the easiest instrument to transfer yourself and your thoughts to another epoch.
And there is in this book again, there is a very funny character who is a hacker. All Russian are hacker. I mean, Russia is full of hacker. Who is a guy who enters in the computer of the people. He steals his data. And at the end he gets a lot of trouble. And I don't tell very much because I think it's a very funny and entertaining book. So I don't want to reveal anyone. But this character is very typical from what you think in Russia.
Well, I mean,
and you imagine
this is a book about Ukraine.
Ukraine. Yeah.
I mean, Russia is more famous for hackers than Ukraine because actually Russia is bigger. But Ukrainian hackers are also very famous. And I mean, maybe you don't know that a lot of IT companies have their offices in Ukraine because they pay Ukrainian IT people less and they get from them much more. I think if you know about Indian hackers, so I mean, I think the new society which is growing, it's trying to catch up. So I mean, it's difficult to compete in life if I mean you don't have a job market, for example, in Ukraine, but you can work for other companies, for other countries. And if you know, for example, film Shrek, animation film, special effects were produced in Ukraine by Ukrainian IT companies. So it's a normal thing to have very well educated computer specialists. And I mean, such a specialist can become a hacker or is a hacker potentially. It depends actually where he gets paid. Well,
or maybe because of the tradition of mathematics, or they are good in chess and in.
Well, I mean, we can try to create sort of explanation. But generally, I mean, people are clever. People are clever everywhere, but I mean, if they have to work harder in order to find good salary or good payment, so they become more capable. They are not lazy, that's all. I mean, if you can find a good job without too much trouble, you will not try to become more knowledgeable in something like this.
And in this book and the book The Death with Penguin, there is like fantasy, but the fantasy belongs to the normal life. I mean, it's a guy who writes and then people dies and he lives with a penguin, which is absolutely normal. And this one, somebody travels to the past, which is absolutely normal. Why do you integrate the fantasy like in the reality?
Well, it's not exactly fantasy because the word normality in the Soviet time meant something else, not like normality in Spain or in Germany. I mean, Soviet normality was slightly surreal.
Yeah.
So what I was doing always, and I loved, I was looking for surreal and absurdic elements which really existed, and I was developing them to the next phase of surrealism. And then life would catch up and would develop them even higher, and I would compete with life. So, I mean, I always hope that I can be more inventive than Soviet and post-Soviet life. But, for example, I wouldn't be able to invent recent presidential elections in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I understand that actually my imagination is limited.
Can you tell us about this? Because, for example, your identity is quite complicated because you are Russia, but you are Russian from Ukraine, which is so you are Ukrainian, but the Ukrainian nationalist thinks that you are not really Ukrainian.
Well, I don't know if you have half an hour. But I mean,
actually, we do.
I will try. I mean, Ukraine is a wonderful multicultural country, bigger than France, where 26 regions, almost all have differences between each other. And for example, I mean, the most beautiful two cities of Ukraine, Lviv and Odessa, have nothing in common. Odessa is a seaport on the Black Sea, built by Spanish, Basque, and French architects. Lviv was built by Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It's like Vienna. In Lviv, until 1939, people spoke Polish, Yiddish, and Ukrainian. Nowadays, I mean, before Maidan, they spoke only Ukrainian. Now, because of the refugees from Donbass, there are lots of people who speak Russian. So half of population speaks Russian, half of population speaks Ukrainian. I'm one probably of 7 or 8 million ethnic Russians, but I'm bilingual. I speak Ukrainian without accent. I write non-fiction and articles in Ukrainian language. I myself identify with Ukraine. So politically, mentally, I'm Ukrainian, not Russian. Why? Because Russian and Ukrainian mentalities are very different. Ukrainian mentality is based on the historical matrix of anarchy. Mm-hmm. Democratic anarchy which existed in 16th century in Ukraine, when Ukraine was free territory without fixed borders, mm-hmm. run by Cossacks, and the Cossacks had elections of their leader. And every time a new leader was elected, there would be immediately attempts to remove him, because every Ukrainian knows what is the best thing for the country, and they could never unite. Russian mentality is based on the monarchy, matrix of monarchy. Russians are collective. They love their Tsar. When they are tired with their Tsar, they kill him and love the next one. And the result, in Russia today, they have, like in the Soviet Union, one-party system. United Russia is Putin's party. Every official is member of this party. In Ukraine, we have 350 political parties registered in the Ministry of Justice. And I don't like neither of them. So if I decide to go into politics, I will start 350 first. But these parties don't have anything to do with conservatism, liberal. I mean, they are not ideological. They are groups of friends or groups of financial partners. And you can buy a small party, actually. It's for 35,000 euros, for example, and you can take part in the local elections if you need it.
But at the end, I mean, with this multitude of parties, it was a guy who is not politician, who is a bad humorist, who win the election and who hasn't party, no? Zelensky has a party?
Well, he created party, and the party is named after his years in which he played.
And he won the presidency.
He won the presidency, which means that actually that Ukrainians were fed up with all politicians, and they wanted non-politician who was very popular, a celebrity, and who promised to remove all the politicians at all from the scene and to put them in the prisons. I mean, he didn't manage yet to put anybody in the prisons, and then he said that his party will take part in the parliamentary election, so anybody who wants to be part of his party should send CVs and biographies to his email. And so we have a majority in the parliament, these people with completely different ideas, but they all became members of this first non-existing party, and now this party really exists, it is registered, and they are members of parliament. So, I mean, it is a unique situation in the world, and I am very happy that Ukraine was the first to show what you can do with politics.
And with all this, I mean, you have like two sizes as a writer, a political writer of what's happening in Ukraine and a writer of novels. Which is more difficult, to write about this surrealistic situation or to invent surrealistic situations?
I think it's easier to invent surrealistic situations because easier to create a novel. You are building a house. You first build the walls, the roof, then you repair the interior, and then actually when everything is ready, you lock it and give the key to the readers. And in this situation, you become homeless. You have to go back to your wife and children. And then you need to start building another house. If you write about political situation, what you write today can be already outdated tomorrow. Because, I mean, the politics are so dynamic now. So, I mean, we don't know what will happen to Trump tomorrow. So, I mean, writing about politics is more difficult.
It's going to be my next question. Zelensky was the guy talking to Trump in all this impeachment mess, no?
Yeah.
And why Ukraine is so important suddenly Ukraine became the country. I mean, Trump was elected by Russia, and Ukraine can be the country who overthrow Trump.
Well, I mean, we have Ukrainian conflicts on two levels.
Yeah.
On the lower level, I mean, I mentioned 15 years ago, the border between collective Soviet or post-Soviet Russian mentality and individualistic anarchic Ukrainian mentality was cutting the country in two halves. But every year this border was moving slowly towards Russia. So, I mean, the Ukrainian mentality was taking over the territory. And if we didn't have military conflict or war, in 10 years' time, the border between mentalities would coincide with the border between Russia and Ukraine. So, in fact, this is one of the reasons of the conflict. The other reason is competition between Putin and Trump, Russia and America, for Ukrainian territory and for Ukraine as the state. Because you know that actually Russia was born in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Kiev was the capital of the ancient Kiev Rus, and the Kiev noble Count Yuri Dolgoruki went and built Moscow many years, many centuries after Kiev was built. So for Putin, actually, Kiev and Ukraine is like sacred Russian territory. And to lose this kind of territory, it means actually to lose the chance or hope to become superpower again. Because, I mean, Trump repeats that we'll make America great again. Putin is trying to make Russia great again without announcing it. And Russia without Ukraine actually much weaker. I mean, they will manage to incorporate Belarus, I think. In 2 years' time, there will be no independent Belarus.
Do you think it will be Russia?
Yeah, because Lukashenko signed a treaty with Yeltsin in 1999 about future united state of Russia and Belarus. And now actually Putin is in a hurry to press Lukashenko into signing all the other treaties.
And do you think that it exists the possibility that Trump is an agent of Putin?
Well, I'm sure Putin has something on Trump. I mean, knowing Trump and his character, including sort of sexual adventures, I wouldn't be surprised if there are several TV series hidden somewhere. Because, I mean, you see, the Congress is very anti-Russian, and Trump is trying hard to be friendly with Putin.
There was a Soviet word for this. It was like compromise or
compromat.
Compromat, yeah. Which is when you have something very compromat about somebody, no?
Yeah.
So, do you think Putin has compromat about Trump?
Well, I mean, two variants. Either Putin has compromat, or they love each other.
Which is, I think, or both.
Both.
And at the beginning in my Spanish presentation, I was talking about two histories of your life, which I find fascinating. The first one is, what you were doing in the Kuril Island?
I didn't go there.
You didn't go, but what is the history?
Yeah. What happened was that I studied Japanese language for 4.5 years in the translator school. And in the beginning we were 45 students. In the end we were 6. Out of these 6, me and my friend were writers, or became writers. And when I had to do my army service, and I was already 24 years old, I was told that I will go to Kuril Islands, to the Japanese Sea, and I will be serving in the KGB unit, listening to the radio exchanges of Japanese military. And for this I was sent 2 times to the military courses, how to do radio espionage and something else. But I thought that I didn't want to go there because after this service, army service with KGB, you wouldn't be able to travel abroad for 25 years.
Oh, yes?
Yes, and I was dreaming about traveling. And my mother was working as a doctor in the hospital for the police. And I asked her if she had a patient in the hospital who is general and who is important and who can change my papers in commissariat. And she found a nice general, and my papers were changed from KGB to military police. So when I got to the assembly point, I was approached by an officer, and he blinked at me, showing that he knows that I am going to the army using connections. And he said that we have for you 3 prisons to choose from. So you can be prison guard for 18 months, either in Odessa prison, in Nikolaev prison, and Kherson. I mean, the other 2 towns, also not far away from the sea. But I said, I want to be in prison by the sea. I want to go to Odessa. And I was taken to Odessa. And the officers there, they were surprised to see me because they said, usually the young people or soldiers with no education are sent to us to be prison guards. And you have 3 diplomas, etc. And I said, well, you know, I didn't want to become a prison guard, but I want to be a writer. And one officer who was responsible for political education of the soldiers, he said, oh, we need a writer. We need a writer because every week we have Communist Party meeting and somebody should write me a speech. And so every evening I was given key from one office of the major, and I had typewriter, Kalashnikov, electric kettle, and lots of military magazines and newspapers. And I was tearing off the pages from the military magazines, tossing them like cards, then crossing out the names of unknown soldiers and officers and putting the names of our officers and our soldiers, retyping this plagiarism, and it would be ready in 2 hours, the job, and then until morning I would write children's stories.
Yeah, you began to write children's story in Odessa prison.
Yeah, and I loved it because, I mean, when you write for children, you become a child yourself. It's the easiest escape from the reality. And the funny thing was actually that in the morning, of course, I was reporting to the officer that I had been working all night on this speech for the Communist Party meeting. And he would say, okay, have half an hour, have a good rest, and then come back.
And you would say that there was 2 kinds of prison, or there are 2 kinds of prison in Russia. One is prison with guards who are not professional criminals, and the prison with professional criminals who are controlled by the criminals for the how do you say, Vori law?
Yeah, I mean the law. There were always problems like this in the Soviet times also. I think in Ukraine we don't have probably now prisons controlled by prisoners. Mm-hmm. But generally, if you have more than like 15-20% of professional criminals in the prison, they will take over control. They will agree with the directors or head of the prison. They will check the order. I mean, they will control the situation in the prison. They will not work because every prison is also a factory or small plant where something is produced. But professional criminals never work. They force the accidental criminals to work for them. Yeah. So the professional prison guards were always trying to have minimum of professional criminals in the camp or in the prison, and in this situation they would control the order.
And there is something of this in this book, no? There are some of these criminals who suddenly appears in this book.
It's mostly about criminals in 1957, yes, in the Soviet times, yeah.
And did you learn the language? I always find passionated the language of the tattoo in Soviet prisons, and I have a book about tattoos in Soviet prison. Can you tell us, did you learn how is this language? It's really an established language.
Well, if I go to sauna, public sauna with strange people around, I will see, of course, a professional criminal.
Immediately,
yeah, because they would have either the church cuples with crosses on their shoulders or on the back, or they would have stars like epaulets. Yeah, but I was more fascinated by the history of tattoos in Stalin's times, because at that time the criminals were trying to make a tattoo of Stalin on the left bosom. And in fact, actually, they were putting Stalin over their heart, hoping that if they are sentenced to death, the soldiers will not shoot in their heart. So the tattoo of Stalin would protect them.
And now they tattoo themselves Putin or no?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, because I mean there is no death sentence in Russia, so I don't believe there are Putin's tattoos.
And there is, I mean, the title of this conference is From Chernobyl to the Soviet Nostalgia, and to the end of the Soviet Union. And did you see the Chernobyl series?
Yeah, I liked it.
I think it's realistic.
I recognized actually the atmosphere and everything, and actually I was in Odessa prison when it happened, but I was allowed to go to visit my family, my brother and my mom and father. My mother was working in this police hospital, which was treating the soldiers and officers and firemen from Chernobyl.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah.
Your mother was
And she told, I mean, she got herself some radiation, but she was operated on and she lived long after that. But what was interesting that immediately after the disaster, there was information that you should drink red dry wine. It helps to get rid of radiation. At first, I thought it is a joke, but in fact, actually, the hospital got huge supplies of red wine, and all the patients in these police hospitals were given a glass of red wine after lunch and after dinner. And at that time, Kyiv was abandoned already by women and children. So, I mean, the husbands sent their families away to Russia, to Ukraine, to other cities far away from Kyiv. And on the street, you would see drunken men, including drunken policemen. And actually, a friend of mine who was a journalist, and he was an alcoholic, unfortunately, but he liked this idea that actually alcohol helps against radiation, but he didn't like wine. So he said that if wine helps from the radiation, vodka should help much better because vodka is stronger. And he started drinking even more vodka to fight radiation.
And does it work?
Well, he died, unfortunately.
But of cirrhosis,
but
not
the
of
wine,
radiation.
I think still people believe that actually wine helps, red wine.
And,
I think Rioja would help a lot.
And why do you think suddenly Occident became fascinated by Chernobyl? Because it was like an international success. A lot of people talk about it. There was like in the magazine, there were suddenly articles about the Soviet style, which it's like you have a short with this until here. Why do you think we became so fascinated by all this Soviet atmosphere?
Well, because it's real and surreal at the same time. It's about the society which doesn't exist anymore. It's about the biggest nuclear accident in the history of Europe or of the world. And also, I think we think about radiation from time to time, and we don't know much about it. And in fact, actually, people stopped talking about nuclear disaster and radiation in Ukraine, in Kyiv, several years after the disaster. So people got used to the idea that, well, radiation is natural and disaster is natural. So, I mean, the film actually shows that it is not natural.
And you have it somewhere, the radiation, the thinking of the radiation when you are in Ukraine, or?
Well, I went several times to Chernobyl zone, a couple of times with journalists from different countries. And when you go there, you are given a radiation meter. You put it, yeah.
I was click.
Yeah. And you are told that if you walk somewhere and it starts beeping very fast, run away, run back. And it's interesting because there is a small industry, touristic industry. It exists already probably for more than 20 years.
But it's getting very, very big because of the series.
Well, you know that the most active tourists to Chernobyl zone are Japanese.
Because of
Even before that.
even
Before they were coming, the scientists, the tourists were coming to see what is happening there. And it is I would say the territory where not all laws are applicable, because from the 30-kilometer zone, after the disaster, everybody was forced out. And then lots of people came back illegally. And 3,000 or more people came back to the abandoned villages. And in order to find them, Soviet authorities were sending in the spring helicopters to see the places where somebody was working on land. If the fields or allotments were plowed or something was planted. So the military, they made maps of the inhabited pieces of land in Chernobyl zone. And then for these people, they decided not to evict them, because mostly these were old people. And the state organized telephone line, military telephone line to each house. And they organized, of course, pension delivery and a lorry with food shop on the wheels that would come every 2 weeks to this village so that somebody could buy products. And when I was taken journalist in 2006, I think, for 20 years of the disaster, the tour of Chernobyl zone included visits to these people, and also it included drinking with these people homemade vodka produced by them in Chernobyl zone. And also, of course, if you are given vodka, you are given some tapas, Ukrainian tapas, mushrooms and ham, etc., and all came from there. So please help yourself, have a proper Chernobyl experience.
Which is completely relative.
It is very relative, yes. we had, I don't remember already, but we had many nice Chernobyl jokes. like a girl is saying,
please.
It's so easy to find my younger brother if he goes away in the night.
Do you remember another Chernobyl joke? So?
Well, it's a nasty one. It's a nasty one.
Go ahead.
The boy complains to, born after Chernobyl, complains to his mother that, Mommy, nobody wants to be friends with me in the school. They say that my head is square. And Mom says, no, Vanya, no, your head is round. She's sort of trying to caress him.
And also, what is incredible in Chernobyl is what has happened with the animals. That is full of...
the nature took over, because, most of the villages are completely abandoned and overgrown, and you have trees growing from inside the houses. So, this is probably the apocalyptic picture, what will happen after mankind. The nature will take over. And it looks like, the forest suffered from radiation. We had yellow forest, but now the yellow trees are dead, and on the same soil you have new trees which are green, and which obviously adapted to this level of radiation which existed there.
And also, and it's related to the beginning of our conversation, I think Chernobyl is a series about what is true when this fails, and the intention of the Soviet government to make what is false, to make it true, and all the way around. We still having this problem? Do you think part of the success of Chernobyl is because of the importance of the fake news, the capacity to build fake news?
Well, it is. I think it is the beginning of fake news. Soviet news were fake, and the news about Chernobyl, they were not only fake; they were criminal, because there was no official announcement about disaster until the demonstration of the 1st of May. So from 26th of April until 2nd of May, only communists knew about, and generals knew about radiation. They moved their families away from Kiev, and everybody else was preparing for the 1st of May demonstration. And then after demonstration, it was first time said that it is dangerous, it's better to keep windows shut and not to go out in the street if there was wind from Chernobyl direction.
And you talk before also of Nadjeva, which means hope. Do you think that all what's happened after the fall of the Soviet Union was a hope betrayed or no? I mean, like everybody thinks of the democracy, the construction of a system based in the social justice, but also in the democracy they elected. And at the end, I thought one of the characters say it, or I read in one of your articles that it was in the hand of a group of thieves, and it was the same people who control this period who are now in charge. For example, Putin was a very important KGB agent. Do you feel that there is a sense of hope who's broken?
No, I think the hope is always there. I mean, the thing is that, I mean, hope lives longer than a man. So, I mean, I developed my own theory of optimism in 1992, when we had very difficult economical and criminal situation in Kyiv, but everywhere in the post-Soviet countries. So there were no jobs, hyperinflation, crime on the street. And many people were emigrating to Germany, to America, to Israel. And a friend of mine asked me, because I was always an optimist, pathological optimist. And he asked, are you still a stupid optimist, or you are normal pessimist as everybody else? And I told him, no, I'm still an optimist, but now I'm black optimist. And he said, what do you mean, black optimist? And I said, well, black optimist is somebody who knows that everything will end well, but he is not sure that he will survive to this moment.
To this moment. And how about the Maidan and the hope that the Maidan represent? When, I mean, again, do you feel that everything went wronger than you think it will go? Because the Maidan was like a big hope for everybody to democratization and another.
Well, I mean, we are democracy in Ukraine. That's why we had Maidan. Because, I mean, like, you cannot have Maidan in China or in Russia.
But now in Hong Kong,
in Hong Kong, yeah, actually, in Hong Kong, they are using a lot of Ukrainian sort of rituals, and they were showing film about Maidan for the demonstrators in Hong Kong. But generally, I mean, Ukrainians are very impatient. They want happiness tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow. And at the same time, they are very open and naive because they choose politicians not because of the promises of politicians, but because they like their faces.
Like Zelensky.
Yeah, like Zelensky. And that's why actually when you are emotionally taking politics, you emotionally react also to things you don't like. And you go out on the street. And I mean, in this society you have huge energy which can throw out one president and install another. But I mean, you can connect it with the hope. Yeah, everybody has hope that we will live better. And we live better, but at the same time there is a tradition to complain about everything in Ukraine. So I mean, like, we have now millions of Ukrainians traveling in Europe because we don't need visa. And at the same time, if you talk to people on the street, they say, oh, we are so poor, we should have salaries 3 times more, or pension 5 times bigger, etc. But I mean, it's a separate case. I mean, if you want to study Ukrainian history or Ukrainian reality, you are welcome to come. You can stay with me. You will need probably 6-7 months at least, but you will love it. And maybe in these 6 or 7 months there will be another Maidan. And so you can take a part and you can become a president of Ukraine.
And you're a good cooker, no? So
yes.
And how the war in Ukraine will finish with the annexation of these territories?
Well, I think while Putin is alive, Crimea will be controlled by Russia. That's for sure. About Donbass, I think 80% of chance that the conflict will be frozen, like in Transnistria, in Georgia, or in Moldova, yeah. Because obviously, the territories of Donbass, which are controlled by separatists, in fact, they're controlled by Russians. And Russia is supplying ammunition and weapons to these separatists. Russian military bosses are teaching separatists how to fight and planning the operations, etc. Although we have now talks between Zelensky and Putin, thanks to Macron, because Macron and Trump, I am sure, agreed that they want to lift sanctions against Russia. For this, they should improve image of Putin. And because of this, we had exchange of prisoners 2 weeks ago, and Oleg Sentsov was released, the film director, and there might be another exchange of prisoners. But generally, Putin wants to show that he is ready for the talks and to solve the problem of Donbass.
And he can retreat the troops, or it's very difficult?
Well, he can, yes, but will he or not, it's not clear. He wants actually that Ukraine accepts these territories, but allow them to be self-governed. So the same leaders who are there now will become official leaders after local elections. They will have their own police, their own army, which means they will have a pro-Russian state inside Ukraine with the right of veto over the decisions of the Ukrainian parliament, which will mean that Ukraine will have to stop approaching European Union. And most of the Ukrainians want to be in European Union, not necessarily as a member, but as a partner.
And do you feel betrayed by the European Union? Because all this began when Ukraine was in the verge of signing a treaty with the European Union, and at the end the European Union, when Russia began the war, the European Union washed their hands.
Well, European Union is run partially also by comedians. But some of them are sad comedians. Boris Johnson is a typical comedian.
But very sad.
Very sad comedian, yeah. Maybe you don't know, but he started fighting against Europe when he was a journalist in Brussels.
In Brussels,
Brussels, yes. And as far as I understand, he invented this joke about Brussels deciding about the shape of bananas to be sold in Europe. So it was a joke which was taken as a reality by many British people, and they still think that actually that Brussels is checking every banana coming into Britain.
And it was a joke made by
Well, it was
Johnson.
a joke, yes.
Made by Johnson?
Yeah.
And there are worse comedian than Zelensky or best comedian than Zelensky?
Well, I think a comedian with much bigger political experience. Yeah. Because Zelensky has no political experience. He is producer, he is a TV comedian, and that's all.
And my last question, because we are going to finish, and you have to sign a lot of books in the door. He will be signing books. Estará firmando libros a la salida. Is at the end of this conversation, what I understand is the only truth, if there is a truth in the old Soviet space, what's humor. The reality. It's this surreal humor that it's in the jokes you tell when you were a child, the books you write. This is the only way. I think at the end the reality must pass through the humor.
Not necessarily. I think in my case, yes. Because although I had wonderful Soviet childhood, and my first books for children were books about baby Lenin.
Baby
Lenin, and then Boy Lenin, and these were children's stories written for children, and I read them, and these were like short story about how Lenin loved to work, or how Lenin loved children, etc. So I decided when I read these books that I will love to work, I will love animals, because Lenin loved animals, apparently, and I will love Lenin. And my second poem, when I was 7 years old, I wrote about Lenin.
And you have also wrote a short history about Chernobyl, no? A Christmas at Chernobyl.
Christmas story, yeah, a Christmas story about Chernobyl, because it's a Christmas story where a young man prepares Christmas surprise for his girlfriend, and he is taking her for the Christmas to Chernobyl zone. and the rest is in the story.
Who hasn't been published in Spain, but I hope it will be published soon. So it has been really a pleasure to hear you
Thank
in
you.
this hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gracias.
Que firme aquí. Estará firmando aquí.